A male corpse was penetrated by parasitic vines, lying on the autopsy table in the hospital. Suddenly, the vines began to grow wildly. They transformed the corpse into a plant warrior. All of this is the result of humanity's illegal destruction of nature in pursuit of money. The deceased's name is Eddie. His body was found at home just the night before his death. Eddie was working in the swamp forest. He and other crew members often formed groups of 2 or 3 to row into the swamp forest at night and deposit a special box in designated locations. This task, however, was illegal activity, and the retribution quickly followed. Eddie's daughter, Susie coughed in class and spat out a black, unidentified gelatinous substance. Feeling unwell, the girl wanted to seek help from her teacher, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't make a sound. She stood up, attempting to catch the teacher's attention. Suddenly, dizziness struck, causing her body to convulse and collapsing on the ground. In addition to Susie, on the same day in the small town, 3 other patients with similar symptoms were brought to the hospital. Abby from the Center for Disease Control examined the patients, but she had never seen such symptoms before. Abby speculated that it could be an infectious disease. After a series of rescue efforts, Susie was out of danger, while her breathing difficulties did not improve. On the clean hospital bed, a stain caught Abby's attention. The stain was a clump of sticky brown liquid, containing pieces of leaves. Finding such a thing on the hospital bed was strange. Abby collected the leaves to be analyzed by a doctor to determine if the sticky substance is related to the outbreak of the infectious disease. An unknown man outside the ward was examining Susie's medical reports. This action caught Abby's attention. The stranger claimed he could help them find the source of the infectious disease. With his confident statement, Abby called for security and had him escorted out of the hospital. As he was being taken away by security, the man remained confident, claiming that Abby would eventually come to him personally to inquire about the infectious disease. After leaving the hospital, Abby went to Susie's house to gather information related to the infectious disease. She encountered her childhood friend Matt outside the house. He was currently a police officer. Coincidentally, he was also investigating there. He mentioned that he hadn't seen Susie's father for several days. As they were inspecting downstairs, they were interrupted by noises coming from upstairs. While investigating upstairs, they discovered the walls of the house's hallway were covered in vines, and the vines were still growing. They followed the sound to a room where they found a man with his back turned, sawing something. The man didn't notice someone behind him. Matt approached and tapped the man on the back. Only then did he stop his action. Startled, he collapsed to the ground and began cursing. Matt raised his gun, ordering him to drop what he was holding. Frightened, the man quickly explained that he was just collecting samples. Abby recognized that this man was the one from the hospital in the morning who made the confident statement. Abby, who already had suspicions about him, she asked him why he was here. The man didn't answer her question. He pointed behind the 2 of them. They turned around, a male corpse entwined in vines, standing in the room behind them. Matt recognized the deceased was Susie's father. The body was taken to the CDC. Even as a medical doctor, this was the first time she had seen such a body. She couldn't provide any scientific explanation. The 2 of them left the house. The man explained to Abby, his name is Holland. He is a botanist. He brought Abby to his research laboratory. He showed her the extract obtained from the swamp, a mutagen. Holland dropped the mutagen into a petri dish. The withered vines grew rapidly at an astonishing speed and exhibited aggression. The vines quickly covered the glass container. Holland quickly opened a valve, releasing a gas that repelled the vines. He believed the mutagen was highly likely the source of the recent epidemic plaguing the town. After returning to the CDC, Abby collected some samples from the body. They analyzed them under the microscope. They discovered plant sample cells on the bodies were unusually active. They had never seen plant cells reproduce at such an astonishing speed. While the 2 of them were studying the samples intently, vines were rapidly multiplying within the body, bursting out of the flesh, covering the dissecting table. The vines pulled the body up into a sitting position. The frightened duo attempted to escape the autopsy room, but the vines grew rapidly. In an instant, they turned the entire autopsy room into a forest of vines. Meanwhile, Susie, who was asleep in the ward, suddenly woke up. She seemed to sense something. She followed her instincts to the door of the dissection room. She saw her father transformed into a monstrous form. Susie was so scared that she fainted. Holland urged Abby to escape quickly. Abby carried the unconscious Susie and desperately ran, but the vines broke through the autopsy room's glass, attempting to capture fleeing Abby. Seeing the two of them leave, Holland picked up the alcohol nearby. After piercing it with scissors, he slid it onto the root of the vines. Then he ignited the alcohol with a lighter. Under the burning flames, the vines no longer continued to grow, but instead recoiled back into the body. Abby took Susie for medical treatment. After performing CPR, Susie finally regained a heartbeat. The two frightened individuals decided to go to a bar for a drink. They encountered Abby's journalist friend Mina, and learned from her that Susie's father took 2 crew members with him last night to Skeeter Cove in the swamp. The 3 of them mysteriously disappeared. Upon learning this, the 2 of them hurried to Skeeter Cove to investigate. They found the boat the 3 of them had used, and discovered a computer inside, along with a black box. After opening the box, they found inside is a release device with a pressure gauge, capable of releasing the yellow liquid underwater. At a timed interval, they brought the computer and box back to the laboratory. Holland felt the yellow liquid in the device bore a striking resemblance to the mutagen he found in the swamp before. He started analyzing the liquid. To his surprise, the liquid turned out to be the mutagen he had extracted earlier. However, the concentration was much higher. Someone must have deliberately submerged the box in water in order to release this mutagen. They guessed correctly. On the previous night, Susie's father and 2 crew members came here. They submerged the black box in water. After the release was complete, they were preparing to move to the next release point, but at that moment, the boat wouldn't start. Not only that, the boat was mysteriously turned around by a force underwater. One crew member was thrown into the water and disappeared. When he resurfaced again, the crew member's face was covered in blood. Just as his companions were about to pull him back onto the boat, he was pulled back into the water. Underwater, the vines were rapidly growing, extending like claws towards the 2 people on the boat. One of them grabbed explosives from the boat and ignited them, and threw them at the vines. After an explosion, the vines finally stopped moving. The 2 of them had just relieved their anxiety. Countless vines emerged from underwater, lifting their boat into the air. The vines pierced through the boat's hull, penetrating the young man who had discarded the explosives. Susie's father barely escaped the swamp, but tragically died at home the next day. Abby suggested sending the mutagen's analysis report to her colleagues at the hospital to see if they could develop a medication to alleviate the patient's symptoms. She was organizing the report. While calling her colleagues, Holland opened the computer that was discovered together with the black box. It contained the location information of the black box to prevent the mutagen from causing further harm to the swamp and residents, and causing worse consequences. He took the computer into the swamp to retrieve the submerged black box. A beam of strong light shone on his face. Holland looked towards the light. He noticed a person in black standing on a distant boat. Before he could finish speaking, the person in black fired 2 shots at Holland. After being shot, he tried to start the engine to escape, but the person in black threw another explosive at him. In the final moment before the explosion, Holland exerted all his strength and flipped into the water from the boat. At the moment he fell into the water, the explosive detonated on the boat. Holland, with 2 gunshot wounds, struggled to reach the shore, but just as he was about to reach the shore, he succumbed to exhaustion and lay at the riverbank. However, at that moment, vines attacked from all directions, penetrating his body. In the laboratory, Abby, who heard the explosion, felt something was wrong. She hurriedly took a boat and came, calling Holland's name, but the response she received was vines crawling all over the boat. The vines lifted the bow of the boat. Abby screamed and fell into the water. To avoid the vines' attacks, she swam towards the shore, but a clump of weeds blocked her path. She pulled the weeds apart. A badly decomposed corpse appeared before her eyes. She was frightened and stepped back. Strangely, the vines that were chasing her from behind also retreated. Countless vines retracted into the water. She looked at the retreating vines in confusion, but a green hand suddenly emerged from the water. A water algae monster appeared in front of her. Startled, Abby quickly fled from the swamp. After a while, Abby returned to the scene with the police officers. She wanted the officers to find the missing Holland. She told them that she had seen a water algae monster here earlier, urging them to be careful during the search. Matt and his mother clearly didn't believe Abby's words. They thought she must have had hallucinations due to the scare. But in reality, that water algae monster was actually the Holland she was looking for. The sheriff comforts Abby. The creature just now could very well have been a wild boar. They immediately start a search with the team. In the distance, Holland, hiding behind a tree, sees the officers walking towards him. He hastily flees from there. After getting far away, looking at his transformed self in the water. Holland can't remember how he became this way. He tears off the algae from his arm, trying to revert to his human form. But no matter how he tears and pulls, the algae quickly regrows. He realizes he might be forever trapped in this monstrous body. He stands there howling in despair. At the hospital, Susie suddenly wakes up. She senses Holland's pain and communicates her feelings to the doctor, hoping they can help Holland in the swamp. But the doctor believes the girl merely had a nightmare. They comfort her briefly and leave. She turns her head and looks out the window. Tree branches are tapping on the window, as if seeking help. When the doctor comes to check again, there is no one in the ward. The open window explains everything. Susie opens the window. She escapes through the window using the tree branches. The doctor immediately informs Abby. Upon learning about this, Abby immediately takes Matt to search for Susie. At the dock, workers find Susie's medical tag. After the two arrive, they notice one boat is missing from the dock, but the workers say the boat was taken by a patrol officer recently. Heading towards Skeeter Cove, the two quickly take a boat to Skeeter Cove. Abby speculates Susie must be hiding on that boat. At Skeeter Cove, two men are replacing the mutagen in the water. They coincidentally encounter the patrol officer. The two men look nervous. They were instructed by their boss not to let anyone know about the mutagen being released. Otherwise, the consequences would be unimaginable. The patrol officer approaches and interrogates, but one of the men impales the officer's head with a harpoon, instantly killing him. The long-haired man orders his companion to continue replacing the mutagen. He plans to blow up the patrol boat and destroy the evidence. Hearing this, Susie, hiding in the patrol boat, takes advantage of the man's handling of the body. She escapes from the cabin, jumping into the water and running deep into the swamp. Susie, who escaped to the shore, is seen by the long-haired man. He is afraid of being exposed. He quickly chases after her. In the swamp, Holland seems to sense something. He immediately runs towards Susie's location. At this moment, the girl arrives at a small cabin. She hides in the attic to escape from the long-haired man, but the long-haired man finds her there. He is ready to kill Susie. He is distracted by a loud noise coming from downstairs. He jumps down from the attic. Suddenly, the transformed Holland appears in front of him. He stabs the monster with a dagger. But for the monster, it's like scratching an itch. The cuts on its body instantly heal, but he doesn't give up. This made Holland impatient. After a roar, countless vines swiftly attack the man. He is suspended in midair, limbs restrained by the vines. The vines exert force from different directions. The long-haired man is torn apart into pieces. This monster is covered in green algae. Its bloody eyes are fixed on her, but Susie is not scared at all. She even communicates with the monster. The monster tells Susie its name is Holland, and it is afraid. Shortly after, Abby follows the sound of the fight and arrives. She asks Susie if she's injured. She is startled by the standing monster, and stands frozen in place. The monster from the swamp is now standing with Susie. Abby quickly takes the girl, and leaves the place. When they look back again, the monster has disappeared. On their way back, Abby learns that the monster was actually Holland. At the cabin, looking at the scattered body parts on the ground, Holland can't believe that he did this. He raises his head and roars. Under the influence of the mysterious power in the dark swamp, Holland transforms into a monster covered in algae. He gains the ability to control and summon plants, but the power of the swamp goes beyond that. Just as Holland leaves, the bodies on the ground are surrounded by insects. Countless insects crawl onto the scattered body parts, causing the body parts to twitch. Some time ago, biologist David is in communication with Sunderland. As the town's wealthiest person, Sunderland funds David to develop a mutagen. The purpose of this is to make the plants in the swamp, under the influence of the mutagen, grow rapidly and consume the water in the swamp, and sell the dehydrated land for profit. However, the mutagen exhibits terrible side effects, causing the local residents to contract a strange illness. To protect his reputation, he arranges for David to be admitted to the CDC, to research methods for treating the infectious disease. Meanwhile, on Abby's side, she and her best friend Liz discuss what happened last night. Neither of them can believe that the monster was Holland. While searching in a hurry last night, the data about the mutagen was left in the laboratory. But to continue their research, Abby has no other choice but to go back to the laboratory and retrieve the information. She enters the swamp once again. Meanwhile, in the swamp, a hunter is hunting. A wild boar lets out a scream, which arouses his curiosity. He approaches to investigate, but he discovers the recently deceased boar is covered in insects. The hunter turns around A body filled with insects stands behind him. The body opens its mouth wide. Countless insects crawl into the hunter's orifices, instantly devouring him. The previous body was the long-haired man who was dismembered by Holland. With the aid of the mysterious power in the swamp, his scattered body parts reassemble, transforming into a monster capable of controlling insects. At night, Abby finally arrives at Holland's laboratory. She carefully examines the documents. She didn't notice the insects beneath her feet until the ceiling makes a sudden noise. She then realizes that it's crawling with insects. The insect creature bursts through the glass and enters the lab. Abby screams in fear at the sudden intrusion of the monster. The monster mutters Holland's name. Remembering that insects fear fire, Abby takes out a flare and ignites it to defend herself. At this moment, Holland breaks through the floor and stands in front of her and warns the monster to stay away from his companion. The insect creature immediately attacks Holland, but it has no effect. It is quickly defeated. Holland looks at the defeated creature. As if understanding something, he extends his hand, dispelling the insects from the creature. The creature, without the support of the insects, instantly turns into a puddle of blood. Abby, saved by the algae creature, finally believes that the green creature is indeed Holland. She consoles him. She will find a way to turn him back into a human. To understand why he has undergone this transformation, she carefully takes a sample from Holland to bring it back to the CDC for research. Abby slices the sample and observes it under a microscope, but the cells in front of her confuse her greatly. Nevertheless, she faithfully records the data. David, who is nearby, sees the data. Being a top biologist, immediately points out that the data is incorrect. How could there be a creature that is both a plant and an animal? Abby doesn't provide an explanation for this. She invites David to observe through the microscope. After observing, David is also shocked by the sample. He is too stunned to speak. The plant cells in front of him have the same structure as animal cells. David, who discovered this new species, is extremely excited. He expresses he can keep this secret, but the condition is to study it together with Abby. In the swamp, Holland looks at his monstrous reflection in the water. His mind is in chaos. He breaks the image in the water with his finger. Suddenly, something emerges from the water. It's a corpse. More and more corpses appear around him. He is terrified, but the vines around him bind him tightly. He can't move at all. He manages to break free with great difficulty. Holland lets out a painful roar. He doesn't understand why this is happening. A bearded man suddenly appears in a boat. The corpses in the swamp disappear. The bearded man faces the creature. He is not surprised by the sight. He even seems like a prophet, as if he had already foreseen everything turning out this way. He tells Holland, plants carry memories that correspond to their lifespan. Holland, who can control plants now, can see the memories of plants through touch. All the corpses seen earlier were from different time periods. The people who died in the swamp. Whenever such a situation occurs, it is the swamp reminding him that people around him will be in danger. After listening, Holland places his hand on a nearby tree. The vines once again restrain him. Immediately after, he then sees a past memory. In the memory, in the water under the bridge, a girl anxiously searches for something in the water. She's calling out the name Shauna. He quickly recognizes the girl is a young Abby. The vines release him. The memory in front of him disappears. After recovering his senses, Holland realizes the bearded man from earlier is now gone. And this is not the first time the bearded man has disappeared. In a small town 8 years ago, a man named Tom came here to shoot a movie. The protagonist of the movie was the Blue Devil, but he was just a stunt double. He couldn't help but complain. A mysterious person found him upon hearing his complaint, and said, if Tom was willing to wait for a woman named Abby, he could become the main character. Tom thought he had encountered someone from the production company. Just as he agreed, the director found him, saying that the production company was dissatisfied with the original protagonist's acting skills, and was planning to replace the lead actor. She expressed high regard for Tom, and intended to cast him as the lead. Tom was about to tell the mysterious person from earlier, but when he turned around, he realized the mysterious person had disappeared. This mysterious person was the bearded man from the swamp. The film shooting was completed. Tom didn't disappoint the director. He gained recognition in Hollywood for his acting skills. He transformed from a stunt double to the leading actor he is today. After completing the filming, he was ready to leave, but he found himself trapped here. No matter what he tried to escape the town, blue flames would ignite on his body. Tom understood. It must be related to the mysterious person. He couldn't leave no matter what. He waited for Abby, to see if things could take a turn. After waiting for Abby with great difficulty, he could finally leave the town. But just as Tom was about to leave the town, the blue flames ignited on him once again. Tom was puzzled. He had indeed waited for Abby as promised. Why couldn't he leave? Could it be that he forgot about some task? On the other hand, Abby arrived at the Sunderland house. She came to examine Susie's health, since the accidental death of her daughter, Shauna, 14 years ago. Abby, as Shauna's best friend, became a thorn in Annie's side. Annie suspected Abby was responsible for her precious daughter's death. Now, Susie became an orphan. To fill the void in her heart, Annie decided to adopt her. Abby went upstairs to check on Susie, but the little girl before her had a completely different attitude. Her manner of speaking and tone resembled that of an adult. She even mentioned the nicknames she and Shauna used for each other. Seeing the adorable little girl transform like this, Abby believed Annie was trying to fill the void left by her daughter. By forcefully instilling Shauna's memories into the girl, Abby was prepared to go downstairs and confront her about it. But the door suddenly slammed shut. The girl also transformed into the likeness of the deceased Shauna. The other party expressed her desire for Abby to drown in the swamp like her. It was evident that Susie was possessed. Abby went downstairs to confront Annie if she noticed the girl's transformation, but she was promptly expelled from the house. In reality, Annie had summoned her daughter's spirit. She wanted Shauna to possess Susie's body, to alleviate her own pain of missing her daughter. But the spirit of a tragic death doesn't obey so easily. After Shauna's death, the power of the swamp turned her into a killing machine. With a host, Shauna even developed murderous intentions towards her own mother. She expressed that she could only survive in the swamp, and hoped her mother would accompany her back to the swamp, so they could be together forever. Finally, the daughter returned to her side. Annie couldn't bear to lose her daughter again. She immediately agreed, and promptly took her daughter to the swamp. Abby, who hadn't gone far, saw the two of them driving away. She followed them in her car. Upon reaching the swamp, Shauna's apparition appeared in the water, and reached out her hand towards Annie. Faced with the dark swamp water in front of her, Annie became afraid, but her beloved daughter was waiting for her in the water. She walked towards the water. Shauna saw her plan about to succeed, and left the girl's body. Upon regaining consciousness, Susie quickly ran out of the swamp. She encountered Abby, who had just arrived, and told her what had happened. When the two returned to the swamp, Annie's lower body was already submerged in the water. No matter how much Abby called out, Annie didn't stop her steps towards the water. Abby had no choice but to take off her clothes and enter the water to save Annie. She walked up to Annie, urging her to leave quickly, saying that Shauna wasn't here at all, but she was grabbed by the neck and forced into the water by Annie. Frightened, Abby quickly swam towards the shore. Annie tried to grab her from behind, but she was dragged into the water by a figure that suddenly emerged from behind. After Abby noticed Annie had disappeared, she entered the swamp once again, and dove into the water to search, but she couldn't find the other person anywhere. She fell into a state of depai. 14 years ago, Shauna also disappeared suddenly into the water. No matter how much she called and searched, there was no trace of her. Suddenly, Holland appeared in the water, holding the drowning Annie. Fortunately, the rescue was timely. Annie's heartbeat returned. Abby asked Holland how he knew she was here. He explained he had seen Abby searching in the river under the bridge, and recognized it as the scene from the accident 14 years ago. She didn't believe it. Holland placed one hand on the tree, and the other on Abby's back. He took Abby into the memories of that day. That day, Abby and Shauna drove to the bridge. They were only 2 days away from graduating high school. It was possible they wouldn't see each other again. Shauna stood on the railing, wanting to have one crazy moment with her friend by jumping into the river from several meters high. But the usually obedient Abby hesitated. Under the repeated urging of her friend, she decided to let loose for once. She walked forward and pushed Shauna off the bridge, thinking it was just a joke between friends. But the friend who could swim didn't surface, and disappeared into the water. She anxiously jumped into the water to search, but still couldn't find her. Suddenly, Shauna emerged from the water. She laughed and teased Abby's frightened expression, but soon she was pulled underwater by a mysterious force. When she resurfaced again, she said there was something underwater, thinking it was another prank. Abby didn't believe her, but Shauna was pulled underwater again. Abby panicked. She immediately dove into the water to search, but she saw the frantic Shauna being pulled further away. She could only resurface, calling out her friend's name in despair. The painful memories of the past resurfaced. Even though 14 years had passed, seeing her friend being harmed once again, tears streamed down her face. The hand on her back moved away. Abby also regained her senses. Holland told her that Shauna was dragged away that day, and the memories that resurfaced were all due to the mysterious power in the swamp. He asked her not to blame herself anymore. After returning to the CDC, Abby continued her research, trying to find a way to turn Holland back into a human. As she was preparing to leave, but David asked her if her previous research was related to Holland. She panicked. She gave a few perfunctory responses, and quickly left. Seeing her reaction, David was almost certain of his suspicions. The reason he speculated like this was because Holland was actually employed by Sunderland. However, different from his own research, Holland was only responsible for studying the plants in the swamp. To confirm his suspicions, he brought people to Holland's laboratory. The signs of a struggle caught his attention. A giant footprint with plant matter stood out prominently on the muddy floor. He collected the plants from the footprint. After studying them, David was once again shocked by what he saw. The cellular activity under the microscope completely overturned his understanding as a biologist. On the other side of the town, after the sheriff's investigation, on the night Holland was killed, apart from his boat, another boat left the harbor. She found the patrol officer to inquire about it, but she was informed by the officer that it was Sunderland's boat driven by her son Matt. Being the wealthiest person in town, his boat usually wouldn't be inspected. But that night, explosion sounds came from the swamp, and after Sunderland's boat returned to the harbor, there were remnants of explosive paper inside. Clearly, Holland's murder was clearly connected to Sunderland and Matt. The patrol officer tried to extort the sheriff for money by using this information, but the sheriff believed that only dead people could keep secrets. She shot and killed the patrol officer with several shots, and confronted Matt to ask for the truth. Matt revealed that Sunderland, upon learning that Holland had discovered the mutagen, used the sheriff's history of bribery as leverage to make Matt kill Holland. He had known all along about the ambiguous relationship between his mother and Sunderland. In order to protect his mother, he killed Holland. At night, Liz and Tom finished chatting at the bar. Liz was about to drive home, yet she found her car tire had been slashed. Two thugs warned Liz not to interfere in other people's business in the future. At that moment, Tom arrived just in time to help, but he was knocked unconscious by the attackers. The thugs got scared and ran away. After being treated, Tom was out of danger, but he became a vegetative state and might remain in a coma indefinitely. In the hospital, David found Sunderland, who came to visit his wife, and said, "The sample Abby studied is highly likely to come from the monster. Its cells possess extraordinary regenerative abilities. He wants to capture it for live research." Sunderland gave David a business card of the town's most famous hunter. At night, Holland tried to save an injured rabbit, but got caught in a giant animal trap. The nearby hunter shot a tranquilizer dart, but the tranquilizer didn't work. Holland broke the trap in half, hoping to scare off the two hunters, but the hunters shot at him. He became enraged and slapped his hand on a tree trunk. Countless sharp wooden spikes shot out from the tree trunk, flying towards the two hunters. The two men realized they couldn't handle the monster in front of them, so they quickly fled on their boat. While the two men were preparing to hunt Holland, David in the hospital was studying the collected samples. By extracting regenerative cells from plants, he created a potion. Only human testing could determine the effectiveness of the potion. He secretly added the potion to Tom's medication. The medicated water with the potion was replaced by a nurse. As the potion entered his body, Tom's heart rate became faster and faster. Liz was attracted by the alarm sound of the monitoring device and came to investigate. She noticed large beads of sweat forming on Tom's arm. Suddenly, Tom abruptly sat up from the bed. He pulled out the tube from his mouth, expressing pain, feeling as if he was on fire. Liz held his arm to comfort him, but was burned by the burning blue flames. Before she could figure out what was happening, she was interrupted by David, who came over. David saw the patient transformed into a plant-like state, regaining consciousness after receiving the potion he created, and even being able to move freely. He felt extremely excited, but it was evident that the medication had some side effects. Only by capturing the monster could they study it thoroughly. Back at home, David's wife, Caroline, also learned about it, that her husband was conducting illegal human experiments. She was very angry about it, and hoped David would stop. However, as a biologist, Faced with such an exciting discovery, he refused to give up no matter what. Caroline suffered from early-stage Alzheimer's, often forgetting what she had just done. As long as he could capture the monster and develop a complete potion, he could cure his wife. At the hospital at this moment, 2 hunters were brought in for treatment. They kept shouting that there was a monster in the swamp. As a police officer, Matt immediately went to the swamp to investigate, where he found huge strange footprints on the ground. He took a boat to search for the monster's trace. Meanwhile, on the other side of the swamp, Abby found Holland, but their conversation was quickly interrupted. As Matt had already arrived there, Abby quickly stepped forward to persuade him to leave, but Matt hadn't reacted yet, and was suddenly attacked by Holland, emerging from the shadows, knocking the gun out of his hand, and pinning him against a tree. Abby stepped forward to intervene, and explained that the monster was actually Holland. Matt found it hard to believe, and struggled to accept that this green monster was Holland, whom he had shot and killed that night. Concerned for his safety, he tested if Holland remembered what happened that night, but learned that the other party did not recognize the person in black from that night was actually him. Only then did Matt feel relieved, and promised to keep the secret. Holland believed, and let him go. However, upon returning to the police station, Matt immediately told his mother, who was a sheriff, about what had just happened. On the other side, Holland and Abby arrived at the laboratory. He looked at the woman he loved, regretting not expressing his feelings to her before turning into a monster. The laboratory remained the same as before, but now, he had transformed into this form, destined to grow apart from Abby. He wished so much to become human again. At this moment, the plants on his body seemed to sense something. Holland felt an itch in the palm of his hand, and after opening his palm, a small purple flower bloomed on it. As the petals unfolded, countless tiny pollen particles floated in the air. After Abby inhaled the pollen, she noticed that Holland had transformed back into a human form. She was surprised and thrilled, but mostly filled with curiosity. Holland explained that he hadn't actually changed. It was the hallucinogenic spores in the pollen that caused Abby to have hallucinations. Seeing him as a human, the more he spoke, the more disappointed he became. His head hung low. Abby couldn't bear to see him so upset, so she changed the subject, mentioning that she was hungry. As Holland searched for food, a branch reached in through the window, laden with fruits. The two of them then arrived at a hidden paradise in the swamp, which was unlike the dark and terrifying swamp, but instead bright and beautiful, filled with flowers of various colors. He explained, although plants are different from animals that express emotions through physical gestures, they actually have emotions, and can feel pain when they are harmed by humans. They also scream in agony, and even desire to fight back. The two of them arrived at a lifeless place, as a result of excessive development and destruction of the swamp by humans. This place had emerged within the swamp. The plants here were corrupted by dark forces, possessing strong aggressiveness, making it extremely dangerous. However, Abby believed this place must be related to the infection and Holland's transformation, and she wanted to develop an antidote. She turned a deaf ear to Holland's advice and approached a fallen, dried branch to take a sample. At this moment, Holland noticed the vegetation here was behaving abnormally and urged her to leave quickly. However, Abby was collecting samples. Suddenly, her arm was grabbed by a nearby vine. He struggled to pull the vine off, but Abby's arm was still injured, and blood flowed from the wound. The two of them quickly escaped. While they were fleeing, the dark forces in the area became restless. In the small town, the sheriff arrived at Sunderland's house, questioning him about why he ordered Matt to kill someone, but Sunderland showed indifference to it. Seeing that the other party didn't care at all, the sheriff then said, Holland is still alive, and Matt saw Holland transforming into a monster with his own eyes. If he returns to the town and reveals the story of the mutagen, then no one can escape legal consequences. Sunderland didn't believe that Holland was still alive. He casually responded he would send someone to the swamp later to investigate, but the sheriff insisted to go to the swamp immediately. Just as they arrived at the swamp, Sunderland raised his hunting rifle from behind, aiming at the back of her head. He didn't believe in things like monsters, considering them baseless talk. Thinking that the sheriff must have malicious intentions, the two engaged in verbal confrontation. As Sunderland was about to pull the trigger, the sheriff knocked the hunting rifle away with one swift motion. Matt arrived just in time, and pushed Sunderland to the ground, rendering him unconscious. To free themselves from Sunderland's control, they dragged him onto a boat, planning to kill him and throw him into the river. But when Sunderland regained consciousness, He faced Matt holding a gun at him and said, "Can you bear to kill your own biological father?" Although the sheriff previously stated that the child's father was someone else, he believed that Matt couldn't be someone else's child. So, he bribed the doctor to collect samples, and Matt, who learned the truth, argued with his mother, realizing that he had been kept in the dark all these years. Sunderland took out the prepared dagger in the cabin. Taking advantage of their argument, he lunged forward and stabbed Matt with the dagger, and quickly turned around, jumping into the water. The sheriff immediately fired several shots into the water, only stopping when there was no movement in the water, and quickly brought his son to Sunderland's house. It turned out that Annie had long known about Sunderland's betrayal, but she didn't expose him. Instead, she conspired with the sheriff to kill him, in order to become the new leader of the company. Just an hour ago, she had just hosted investors and the David couple, and asked David to show the company's research results to her, and expressed that she would take over the company. The investors were very satisfied with their research results, and immediately expressed their willingness to cooperate, and would provide funding to capture the monsters in the swamp. At this moment, in Holland's laboratory, the two returned here to treat their wounds. The dark forces were continuously corrupting Abby. Seeing her beloved in such pain, Holland immediately used his green energy to heal her. As time passed, the hallucinogenic effects of the spores faded away. Holland transformed back into his monstrous form. The dark power of the swamp was too strong. There were too many unknown dangers here. He chose to accept his fate of being unable to turn back into a human, and told her not to go to the swamp anymore. But how could Abby abandon her loved one? After leaving the laboratory, she immediately left the town with the samples, rushing back to the headquarters of the CDC. Upon returning to the headquarters, she discovered her ID card no longer had access rights. Unable to use the advanced equipment at the headquarters, the samples she brought were confiscated and isolated. In her office, Abby encountered two bald men. One of them was the investor Annie had hosted. The investor stated he was already aware of Holland's situation, and he wanted her to help them, advising Holland to cooperate with their research. Otherwise, they would forcefully capture him and take him back for research. Abby cursed at the man, and then turned around and left. She just wanted to inform Holland as soon as possible that he was in danger. On the swamp side, Sunderland dragged his injured body, climbed onto the shore, under the sheriff's gunfire. Getting shot in the leg was considered fortunate. After bandaging the wound, he was determined to leave the swamp and seek revenge on the sheriff. While the forest was like a maze, making it difficult to determine the direction, he picked up the dagger and carved an A on the tree in front of him, as a marker to prevent getting lost. Something seemed to be shaking on a tree ahead. Suddenly, footsteps were heard behind him. Sunderland immediately turned around, asking who the person was, but there was no response at all, so he continued on his way, trying to get out of this foggy forest as soon as possible. Just a few steps out, the previous marker disappeared. Not knowing how long had passed, Sunderland became exhausted. As he lay down on the ground to rest for a while, a familiar voice came from the side. He looked up, and saw the sheriff standing on the opposite side, holding a hunting rifle at him. He was now completely exhausted. He immediately fell to the ground, and begged for mercy, speaking sweet words in an attempt to awaken the woman's sympathy. But these words had no effect, and the other person still pulled the trigger. After a gunshot, he found himself unharmed. He thought his words had worked, so he prepared to make amends with the sheriff once again. However, countless vines grew out of the woman's orifices, and he was frightened. Collapsing to the ground, he prepared to get up and escape, but he realized there was no one in front of him. At night, he still couldn't escape the swamp. Sunderland lay on the ground, sinking into despair. Suddenly, a green figure appeared before him. He was so scared that he fainted. When he woke up again, he found himself lying on a comfortable bed. Worm-like creatures crawled on his leg wound. He thought his wound had become rotten and infested with maggots. He quickly pulled them out of the wound and threw them on the ground. But the figure in the dim corner said, "Those worm-like creatures are a type of plant called sphagnum moss, which has remarkable effects in treating wounds. If you want the wound to heal faster, it's best not to disturb them." Sunderland asked the other person who they were, and Holland revealed his identity. He walked out from the corner, the botanist who was once employed by Sunderland, turned into a monster, and Sunderland was startled by his current appearance. Holland was angry at the man before him, because of greedy individuals like Sunderland, who exploit nature, which leads to awakening dark forces, turning the swamp into its current state. But Sunderland excels at manipulating people's hearts. After a moment of persuasion, he not only disguised himself as a victim, but also claimed to have a scientist under his command who could cure him. Upon hearing the name of the scientist, Holland's hope rekindled. David is well known in the biology community, so he agreed to meet Sunderland in the swamp tomorrow. Holland used green energy to conjure a boat for him to leave the swamp. Sunderland heard this, and expressed his happiness. He promised to turn his lifesaver back into a human. After returning to the town, he immediately went to David's residence. David looked at Sunderland with full of confusion. This confusion was quickly replaced by another emotion, as Sunderland showed his previously shot wound, and claimed that Holland healed his leg wound with his own power. This regenerative ability once again shocked him. During their conversation, Sunderland learned that Annie took over his company, successfully negotiated with investors, and rebuilt a laboratory for David. He only realized then that he had been tricked by two women, after being betrayed by loved ones. At this moment, he thought more about Holland's life-saving favor, so he genuinely asked David if he could cure Holland. Upon hearing this, David began to brainwash Sunderland. He said, if they were to cure him, as a regular human being, Holland, he would be of no value to them. But as he is now, possessing the miraculous ability to regenerate cells, they can exploit each other's cell regeneration ability to gain wealth and achieve worldwide fame, becoming a great figure with both fame and fortune. The insatiable Sunderland instantly changed his mind after hearing this. The original savior, in his eyes, was nothing more than a fattened lamb waiting to be slaughtered. The next evening, the three of them met as agreed. Holland finally appeared before him. David, the biologist, he managed to restrain his excitement and joy. He said, if Holland goes back to the laboratory with him, there must be a way to turn him back into a human. Sunderland was also present, urging Holland not to miss this opportunity. Unexpectedly, Holland, however, refused the invitation from the two. He turned around and prepared to leave. As he sensed, there were more people hiding here. The two individuals didn't actually want to help him. Indeed, before he took a few steps, a group of hunters surrounded him. They aimed their guns at Holland. These people didn't have a clear understanding of his abilities. Holland didn't want to harm them. He simply warned them to leave quickly. Yet the hunters still launched an attack. Even so, Holland still refrained from using lethal force. What he didn't expect was, Sunderland raised his gun and launched a surprise attack, hitting Holland's heart. Although he could regenerate his heart, the immense damage caused him to fall to the ground in pain. Taking advantage of Holland's moment of respite, they surrounded their target. They sprayed liquid nitrogen to freeze him, and took him to a new laboratory. They immobilized Holland on an ice bed. The laboratory was illuminated by eerie green light. This green light was specifically prepared by David, which could inhibit Holland's cell regeneration speed and ability. David turned the valve of the liquid nitrogen tank, slowing down the release rate. He intended to dissect Holland and carefully study the body structure of this never-before-seen creature. Abby, who hurried back to the town, immediately went to the swamp to search for Holland, but she was still one step too late. The swamp was an area frozen over, with scattered shell casings on the ground, as well as imprints resembling Holland's figure caught her attention. She realized Holland had been captured. The next morning, she sought the help of her friend Liz. David raised her suspicion, and the two of them went to David's residence. David wasn't home, but footprints with mud on the floor confirmed that he had been to the swamp last night. After the initial speculation was confirmed, Liz, her good friend, found numerous analysis reports on the table, along with some laboratory blueprints. The two of them started comparing the blueprints with the town's buildings, trying to locate the laboratory. The town wasn't a big place, and soon they identified the internal structure through comparison, narrowing it down to Sunderland's old cement factory. The old cement factory was in a very remote location, making it ideal for these people to engage in illegal activities. It was almost certain that it was the new laboratory, and if Holland was truly there, he would undoubtedly be in extreme danger. There was no time for speculation. The two of them immediately headed to the old cement factory. In the hospital at this moment, Tom was lying on the bed, encountered the mysterious person once again. He became in his current state, was all because of the mysterious person's appearance. He was about to question the person about why he was trapped in the town, when he suddenly found himself in an unfamiliar location. Abby and Liz ran out from behind, calling out their names, but they didn't respond. The two of them hurriedly hid inside a room, and a group of mercenaries stormed in. Discovering the two hiding in the room, they surrounded the two of them, firing their guns at them. The two of them were shot and killed on the spot. Tom watched everything unfold, pain showing on Tom's face, mixed with a bewildered expression. The mysterious person spoke. What you saw was the future. To be more precise, it was a possible event. Only you can change all of this. The scene from earlier faded away, and Tom was still lying on the hospital bed. The mysterious person placed the Blue Devil's headgear on the bed, signifying that it could grant Tom the power of the Blue Devil. While Tom expressed he had no interest in the future here, and only wanted to leave this eerie town as soon as possible, the mysterious person stated that it didn't matter. Regardless of the outcome, the choice was in Tom's hands. Then the mysterious person left the hospital room. After the mysterious person left, Tom decided to intervene. He picked up the headgear from the bed. Amazingly, the headgear reacted as soon as it was picked up, emitting a dazzling blue light from within the headgear, as if transferring some kind of power to Tom. The immense energy made him unable to resist screaming. After a while, two horns actually grew on Tom's head, and the energy emanating from his body burned the curtains next to the bed. Meanwhile, in the laboratory, Holland was awakened by intense pain. He realized he had been disemboweled by David, but the gunshot wound and injuries from the nitrogen freezing rendered him unable to resist. The green light in the laboratory suppressed his recovery speed, and he could only endure immense pain, watching David remove his organs from his body. At this moment, David was deeply fascinated by the organs before him, as these organs were actually plants, merely decorative displays. They didn't have the functions of real organs. Yet Holland, whose organs were removed, could still communicate normally. He finally understood the cause of the transformation. It turned out that, after the explosion of the explosives, the mutated plants absorbed Holland's consciousness and reconstructed a humanoid body based on human memories. He wasn't human at all, but a plant with human thoughts. Hearing this, Holland broke down and screamed. His hope shattered completely. At night, Abby and Liz arrived outside the old cement factory. As a doctor, Abby quickly recognized the mobile medical facility parked outside the factory, confirming that this was indeed the laboratory. However, armed soldiers were guarding the outside. Liz suddenly remembered there was a gap in the fence here. They crawled through the gap and entered a warehouse. While the two were searching for the laboratory where Holland was held, grass started growing on the floor beneath their feet, forming a path of plants, guiding them towards Holland's location. They followed the path, but they stumbled upon an iron rod on the way. The iron rod fell to the ground with a loud noise. Liz quickly picked up the iron rod, and they hid in an electrical room. The soldier on duty was attracted by the sound, and entered the warehouse to investigate. This was exactly the same as what Tom had witnessed. The soldiers soon realized someone was hiding in the electrical room, and urged the person inside to come out. Upon realizing they were exposed, Abby quickly pulled the switch, plunging the factory into darkness. Only the laboratory still emitted green light. The soldiers planned to shoot and force them out. At the critical moment, a ball of blue flame appeared out of nowhere, igniting one of the soldiers. He let out a painful scream and struggled desperately. The soldiers started shooting frantically, but the flame suddenly disappeared. As they searched for it, Tom, now transformed into a blue devil-like figure, suddenly appeared. He lifted a soldier in the air, and the blue flame spewing from his mouth engulfed the soldier. It didn't take long, and he defeated all the soldiers. Suddenly, the door of the electrical room was opened, and a soldier muttered about a demon, but he was suddenly grabbed by an extended arm around his neck. The face of the Blue Devil appeared in front of Abby and Liz. They were stunned in place, but the Blue Devil turned and left. After the creature moved away, the two immediately got up and followed the guidance of the plants to continue searching for Holland. Soon, they arrived outside a laboratory emitting green light. After hearing the sounds of fighting outside, David packed up the organs he had taken and escaped back home, leaving Holland lying on the operating table. Entering the laboratory, Abby looked at Holland in front of her with deep pity. Guided by him, Abby turned off the green lights. Under the effect of regenerative cells, they grew back one by one. The cut abdomen was also stitched together by plants. Holland, who hadn't fully recovered, stood up. He walked towards the door, indicating that he wanted to return to the swamp. To verify something, Abby accompanied him to the swamp. Holland walked into the water bay, where the incident occurred that night, and before long, he emerged from the water holding a skeleton, and placed it in front of Abby, and said, The real Holland is already dead. He's just a monster." Although David's words were confirmed when the skeleton was retrieved, she still believed that the monster and Holland were no different. While Abby was comforting him, Holland sensed once again that someone entered the swamp. This time, Holland wouldn't let anyone harm him anymore. He would make them pay a heavy price for himself and for the swamp. He would strike back fiercely. He urged Abby to leave quickly, and then rushed into the forest. The investors were leading their subordinates in search of him in the forest. After the previous encounter, the investors were determined to seek revenge. They were bound to kill Holland. Soon, the two groups encountered each other in the forest. Holland was now completely enraged. He let out an angry roar and killed the soldiers, leaving only the investor. He warned the investor never to come to the swamp again. The investor was scared by Holland and fled the swamp, crawling and rolling. In the town, David returned home. He discovered his wife had taken all her medication during her illness, and the side effects caused her to lose control of her muscles. She became a conscious frozen person. He looked at his wife with both pity and guilt, but David quickly pulled himself together. He tied his wife to a dining chair with duct tape and took out Holland's organs from the box. He introduced them to his wife. These incredible organs. He didn't notice his wife was already in tears from fear. He planned to cook these organs and feed them to his wife, believing it could cure his wife's illness. He cooked the heart into a dish, attempting to feed it to his wife. His wife's eyes were filled with fear and doubt. He took a bite of the dish containing Holland's heart, personally experiencing the magical power of regenerative cells. Before long, the cells started to take effect. He felt energized throughout his body and felt a connection with the surrounding nature. As he excitedly described his feelings to his wife, Abby burst into his house. She saw Caroline's empty medicine bottle and the woman tied to the chair. Abby immediately realized the other person had overdosed on medication. She wanted to take her to the hospital for treatment and dialed for emergency assistance, but David knocked the phone out of her hand onto the floor. He explained to Abby and showed her the dish he had just prepared. He was preparing to feed it to his wife. Abby stepped forward to stop him, but David lifted her up. Fortunately, the police arrived in time based on Abby's phone location. They used a taser to subdue David and took him to the police station. Earlier, the sheriff arrived at the hospital, and the doctor explained Matt had been in a car accident the previous night due to drunk driving. He was currently unconscious. She had been with her son in the hospital room all day. In the evening, just as she finished tucking Matt in, the woman heard footsteps behind her, but when she turned around, Sunderland appeared in front of her. Sunderland said, "Annie now has severe mental issues and has been restrained." He came this time without ill intentions, as he intended to divorce Annie and start a new family with the sheriff and Matt. But what he didn't know was, because of Sunderland, the sheriff's own son had become a murderer and was seriously injured. She wouldn't believe this man's words. The woman drove Sunderland away. After spending some more time with Matt, she left the hospital, opened the car door and sat in the driver's seat. She fastened her seatbelt, preparing to drive back to the police station. But behind her, there was a familiar figure. Through the rearview mirror, she was surprised to see Sunderland sitting in the back seat. Just as the sheriff called out his name, he was stabbed in the stomach with a knife by Sunderland. Then Sunderland tampered with the car. He stepped out of the car, watching the car drive itself into the swamp. The sheriff collapsed in the car. The car sank deeper into the water. In this way, Sunderland killed the sheriff, who had originally planned to drown herself. After returning to his car, he prepared to leave the town. But suddenly, he started coughing and coughed up a leaf. The next morning, Tom, who had experienced numerous failed attempts, was ready to try leaving the town again. He pressed the accelerator. This time, Tom wasn't burned by the blue flames. 8 years later, he finally managed to drive out of the town, because this time, he had completed his mission for coming here. Abby, who also arrived in town with a mysterious mission, chose to stay here. She wanted to face the unknown dangers. In the swamp with Holland, all the characters had their own endings, but plants started growing in the police station. A creature with a striking resemblance to Holland suddenly appeared. This creature is David, who consumed Holland's organs. The TV series Swamp Thing, as a sci-fi show, featuring mutated creatures and the dark forces of nature fighting back, sounded the alarm for protecting the environment, to stop the reckless destruction of nature. The film revolves around love as the main storyline, with friendship as a subplot, accompanied by themes of revenge and salvation, showcasing the same forces of nature, in the face of good and evil. It also displays completely different powers, provoking deep thoughts. If you enjoy my channel, please please consider subscribing.